Hi, this is Liv Morgan, and you are listening to No One Knows, a deep dive podcast into the mysterious death of Joann Matouk Romain. Our 7th episode featured an interview with Joann's daughters, Michelle and Kelly. I just want to make sure that everybody knows it's the best to start at the beginning of our season and don't jump around, as there's a lot of information included and it needs to be in chronological order. You're going to be able to get a better accurate timeline, current information, and a sense of where the investigation is in the process right now. Before we dive into episode 8, I'd like to touch on a few items that I think need to be covered. Joann's daughters and myself have noticed that another podcaster decided to cover the story of Joann. During the one-part episode, they touched on a lot of items that were reported incorrectly by the podcaster, along with some insensitive comments towards Joann's mental health. I would like to use our podcast, No One Knows, to emphasize the importance of reporting on facts. When you are given a platform to speak in front of 1,000, even millions of people, it is possible for the things that you say to set a case back years. During that time, I reported the podcast. Joann's daughters sent an email frustrated and hurt by the storyline that was narrated. I want to be very clear. When discovering Joann's case, I found it odd, but I didn't come into this case automatically assuming somebody was guilty and that this was a murder and a cover-up. If I did that, I wouldn't be a true journalist. From December until now, I have worked closely with a lot of the individuals who have worked on this case. These individuals include private investigators, reporters, officers, dive team crew, and lots of people that I can't mention. This podcast wasn't a 15 minutes get famous type of gig. My initial email to Joann's daughters was that it felt like intuition had pushed me here. I continually was told about the case. I had met people who were somehow involved in one way or another with the case. I truly felt like Joann pushed me to do this and put me in touch with her daughters. Call it a crock of shit or whatever you want, but my intuition has never guided me wrong. All information I report has been documented, fact-checked, and has credible paper trail to it. During the writing of each episode and fact-checking, I continually make calls to those that I need to, confirming what I'm writing, because even I need confirmation. With a story, with a web this big and roots so deep, it's easy to make a mistake. I'm a very visual learner myself, and it's always important to me to do a quick Google search while listening to any other podcast. I truly feel that I can follow a podcast better when I'm able to put faces to names, looking at maps, seeing. I try to make this podcast as easy and simple, but it's difficult when the case is so in-depth and there's so many people involved. So, at any point during our episodes, you are able to go directly to our Instagram page. Each time an episode is posted, an Instagram post is made as well. The Instagram page usually hosts the documents, records, any type of images that are going to be needed for visually understanding what the headline of that week's episode is about. And if you're not already following us on Instagram, our Instagram handle is No One Knows Pod, and we're also on Facebook. There's a special group that you can request to join. It's No One Knows Podcast. Okay, now that I've gotten that out of the way, I want to touch on something else. I saw something yesterday that Maura Murray's family had posted. Maura was a young woman who disappeared in February of 2004, and I've been really intrigued by her case for many years, but I will link her deep dive podcast in our show notes for today. I've followed her case for many years and have been inspired by her family's fight for justice. And when I was on Instagram yesterday, I saw something that she had shared. And it says, quote, "Can you tell the difference between a content creator who exploits a victim and a creator who advocates for a victim? The families aren't here because they wanted these tragedies to happen to them. Let's listen to what they have to say." End quote. This stuck with me for hours after I read it. Be a creator who advocates for a victim. So today on episode 8, we're going to continue to advocate for Joann as a victim, as the family has done for the last 14 years and continues to do even today. So this week's episode was supposed to be on the dynamics of the family. And as I began writing, I constantly go back and look at things. So I look at documentation, I look at reports, I look at things, and I go back through them multiple times. I've spoke with Kelly and Michelle, and I've explained to them that at times I read something, I notice one thing, and at another moment I read something else and I notice that. So this wasn't my initial plan for today's episode, but after so many questions that have been asked about and more details on how this wasn't actually a suicide, I thought it would be best to revisit one of the most important evident pieces in the 2016 lawsuit. So here's the breakdown of one of the most important pieces of evidence. From David S. Smith, he's a PhD commander and a retired United States Coast Guard. So reading through the documents, it states, quote, "In the past 4 years, I have been retained and testified as an expert witness in the following cases," end quote. Listed below is 22 cases where he was used and his testimony was used in trial cases. He also states the following with a long list of accomplishments to further weigh credibility on his testimony. Quote, "I have been employed as an expert witness in aquatic litigation, including accident reconstruction for both plaintiff and defense for 35 years. More information concerning my professional history, service experience, and duties, plus my educational background, including my resume and curriculum, is available at my website, www.aquaticsafety.com. End quote. So what does it mean? It means that the person who wrote this has 35 years worth of evidence, 35 years worth of experience, 35 years of perfecting the craft of knowing how accidents can happen, reconstructing them. So, what does this document say? The report states the following. Quote, "Detroit received a call from a station in St. Clair Shores stating that Grosse Pointe Police Department found an abandoned car in the vicinity of the St. Paul's Catholic Church on Lakeshore Drive. The police indicated that there were shoe prints leaving the car and heading into the water. Upon further investigation, they stated that there appeared to be a hole in the ice. Station St. Clair Shores launched a rescue vessel to the location of the incident. Command Center of the 9th Coast Guard District was notified and requested the launch of a helicopter from Air Station Detroit." The next part is going to be extremely heavy on the details, so please listen closely to the timeline. The quote directly from the report states that the U.S. Coast Guard Sector Detroit created a message listed as N16130, which explains the situation of the case. The situation covered, the message runs from January 10th to February 15th. And in Michigan time, this is from 6:05 p.m. on January 12th, 2010 to 5:57 a.m. on February 3rd, 2015. The next portion states that the next of kin reported that a woman had been missing since 5 p.m. Note, Grosse Pointe Farms PD personnel states that they received the information from the victim's daughter, Michelle, which she in turn states is completely untrue. If you go back to N16130, which is the original message that they received, the message states, quote, "Police contacted the car owner, redacted. We know this is Michelle. We know this was her car that was parked at the church parking lot. She stated that her mom dropped her off at a residence and then left to go to the church around 5 p.m. She has been looking for her mother since 5 p.m. In section 0 of the message, it also contains a statement that local PD got a hold of the Michelle, it says redacted, of the woman who owns the car. She reports the car owner that has been missing since 5 p.m. local time. It states in here that Michelle Romain has denied making any such statements to the police. And it also notes that anyone, including police personnel, knowingly making false reports to the Coast Guard units to respond is subject to federal prosecution. If the police had a statement informing them of Miss Romain's being in church at 5 p.m., why would she be considered missing from then on, as it was initially known she was at the church?" End quote. I know this is a lot of information, but I'd like to move on to something else because it's been brought up. I want to report on the weather and the water current at that time. So, it is stated from the document, quote, weather reported at 9:51 p.m. The wind speed is noted as 5 knots, gusting to 7 knots with an air temperature of 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice covering is 10% with an ice character of no ice, meaning there is a scattered skim, thin piece of ice. So far into the report, we have come across 2 forms of information that are already incorrect and have been, I would say, told that they are lies. St. Clair Shores contacted the Coast Guard stating that Grosse Pointe Farms PD noticed shoe prints leading from the car to the water. This is false. The little crime scene photographs that were taken clearly show that the pavement next to the car is not covered in any sort of snow. The only area where snow was sticking would be non-pavement areas, such as grassy. All of the pavement areas were wet and black. There was no signs of any snow next to the vehicle. Secondly, why would Michelle have reported her mother missing if she wasn't missing? And let's just for hypothetical reasons say that Michelle could have reported her mom missing. Why would she lie about it now? If her mom was missing, don't you think they would have been the first to report it if she actually did go missing? I mean, look at the fight they've put up for the last 14 years. I don't think it's something they'd come back on. If at any point Joann was actually missing, Michelle and Kelly, Michael, any of the family would have reported her missing. But it's the fact that even in the documentations, they're saying the next of kin reported her missing. That's false. She was never missing. She was still with her family. She was dropping them off. She was getting gas. She was heading to church at the time that they're saying they received this call. It's very odd. Let's head down to the water. When divers make their way into the water searching for Joann. In the report, it states, quote, Coast Guard entered the water and searched with poles in a grid search pattern 100 feet out and 500 yards down the shoreline. The air unit made multiple passes. MTRT, dive team, leader, and tactical worksheets indicate that the underwater searches over several days were repeatedly made in calm, clear, and shallow water with no current noticed. End quote. So you're probably asking me, Liv, why the fuck are we going back over all of this information? So, it's important that we get all of the facts nailed down in details. All this information is relevant again, but how I release the facts is just as important. If you've never heard of Joann's case, and in the first few episodes I released 100 names with timeline stories, all the information, things can get pretty confusing pretty fast. And so for right now, we're going to continue to pick apart the law official story until a real investigation is done. But for now, we're going to go back to the report. This part really struck me. It says, quote, the autopsy results show that the victim's lungs were no more than the normal weight for a woman her age and size. In most drowning victims who have descended downwards, due to the loss of lung buoyancy, lung weight due to water absorption may be seen to double. This would especially be the case in someone believed to have drifted along the river bottom a considerable distance. End quote. Remember, it is in the police reports. They're stating that she walked into the water and committed suicide by drowning and began floating down the river and was not seen because she was sinking on the water's floor. But back to the report. David also states in his report, quote, historically, males drown 4 to 5 times more frequently than females do. And one reason for this is that women are more naturally buoyant as they have a greater layer of fat than men. And in numerous repeated instances of teaching floating and self-rescue strategies, it can be readily appreciated that a relaxed lung, inflated and fully clothed female can float flat on her back with her feet level with her head. The greater amount of fat that is present in a person's physique, the more easily they float. Miss Romain is described as overweight to the point of being obese in the Canadian autopsy. End quote. I want to go back to Joann's clothing for just a minute. I think it's important that we re-emphasize how she was found, and how all of her clothing were on her and intact. David states in his report that Joann's clothing would have hindered her from going below the surface. Here's a quote directly from his report. Contrary to popular misconception, almost all of Joann's clothing and footwear is positively buoyant, especially if air is trapped in multiple layers of apparel. Miss Romain was found fully clothed, including a jacket under a coat. Should that coat be insulated with a waterproof outer layer, its flotation potential is heightened. Due to her physical characteristics and clothing, add in the lung buoyancy of dry drowning, it would be next to impossible for her to sink below the surface and to not be discovered. This is especially true in clear, unmoving water, 2 to 3 feet deep, repeatedly searched by multiple people under, above, in, and around the location of where she entered Lake St. Clair almost immediately after she was reported missing. So what exactly is David saying here? David is stating that in his report, he finds it extremely unlikely that if Joann had gone in at the water's edge at Lake St. Clair by the church, that her body would never have gone under the water, specifically for the reasons of the buoyancy inside of her lungs and the clothing that she was wearing. So, what does that conclude? Joann didn't go into the water in front of the church. Joann was never there in front of the church in that water. Based off of the records that I am reading and seeing, multiple agencies found no evidence of her inside of the water. The only people that ever mentioned her being inside of the water and listed this as a, quote, suicide are Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods detectives. The same ones who were in on all of the misconceptions when it comes to timeline. The next part I feel is extremely important to touch on, but it's something that we haven't mentioned previously because it's something that I just came across. We are going to be talking directly from Joann's autopsy report, so please proceed with caution, and if this is anything that could possibly make you upset or worried or concerned or possibly re-traumatize you, please fast forward about 30 seconds. David states that during the autopsy completed by the University of Michigan, sand-like particles were found in her trachea. But what's odd to me is the correlation that David makes into how the sand particles could have gotten there, and how they are a true contradictory of how Joann died. Here is David directly from his report. Quote, "This would indicate that at the time of her ingesting sufficient water to trigger a laryngospasm, her mouth and nose had to be near or in contact with the bottom or in a disturbed water close to the bottom. If so, she would have lost consciousness and remained in the shallow water location. Therefore, her body should have been immediately observed by search and rescuers near the shoreline shallows." End quote. This was the first time that I heard and read about the sand particles being found on the autopsy. And it wasn't for a lack of not doing my research. It was simply the fact that there is so much information out on Joann's case that it's so much for one brain to hold. Yes, I have a running list of all the odd things that I find and diagrams with, red strings connecting people. But this part really struck with me. It was odd because it's something that when I spoke with Michelle and Kelly, we all kind of forgot about it. We had read it obviously before going through the reports, but it's something that I think should be extremely emphasized on. It completely contradicts the things that they are saying could have happened to Joann. So, I'm going to read you David's conclusion and what he states in his report. The small amount of water that she ingested to trigger the laryngospasm had to be in shallow depth, close to shore, to allow sand grains to be found in her trachea. And then her trachea would become sealed. There would be no other means for entry of these particles. The sand particles had to be drawn from an extremely shallow depth, or she was forced underwater, as her head, due to her buoyancy, would be severely restricted in its ability to penetrate a limited distance below the surface. her body most logically would have been located in the non-current affected water close to the shore where it should have been quickly discovered. Aiding this is that a large portion of her back should have been protruded above the surface. The scenario describing her body moving down and crossing the Detroit River is fallacious and illogical. Even if she were a, in quotes, wet drowning victim, deep water, such as in the river's bottom, is colder than the shallow surface water. The coldness of the water would positively mitigate against and prevent the formation of degenerative gases that cause sunken bodies to rise to the surface when the water warms. Her body being found partially immersed above the river's surface in March borders impossibility if it hadn't been lying on the cold river's bottom since January. Due to her dry drowning, it is impossible for Miss Romain's body to have been underwater during the search for her along the shallow shore when she was first reported missing. There was also no current in the area perceived by any rescue personnel who had searched the area for many hours over several days. The only way for her body to have moved would have been due to wind action on her torso exposed above the water. This would also have meant that she would have been extremely visible to all of the searchers on shore, in boats, walking in the water, and searching by helicopter. From an aquatic standpoint, there is simply no reason to believe that she entered the water and had drowned in the area determined by officers. So, you heard it for yourself right from the report. Joann didn't drown there. So what's my theory? I think that the scene at the water's edge was actually a distraction for what was going on. I think that they used it as a way to look qualified and professional into a missing person's case. Big air quotes on missing person here. So again, why am I bringing all of this up? You're probably listening to this podcast on your way to work, on your lunch break, or on your way home from work. And during that time, you've probably listened to this podcast thinking of all the ways Joann could have died and how all of this just seems fucking odd. What outrages me the most and consumes a lot of my thinking is the fact that our taxes paid for the corruption and continues to pay for the cover-up of Joann's murder. Your hard-earned money, the money that you're going to make when you're driving to work listening to this podcast, your taxes have been put in the hands and have paid those that are behind this case. Your tax dollars have ultimately paid all of the lawyer fees from the lawsuit towards Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods Police Department. It's your money. If that doesn't make you upset, I don't know what will. If you're frustrated, pissed off, sickened, worried, I urge you to write a letter to your local newspaper. It can be anonymous. Call into Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods. Ask them what happened. Call the Wayne County Prosecutors office. Demand justice for Joann. A new investigation is time. It's now. And we have the opportunity as taxpayers to hold the people in power to a standard. So what happens when public office is used for personal agenda? In a normal scenario, that person would be fired or put on leave until an investigation was completed. But for some reason, any person that's been involved in this case, not one single person has ever been put on leave to be investigated. Through the depositions, I've been able to notice a pattern here. The case is then passed on to a manager, and a higher-up will look at the case, and they'll pass it on to their manager or their higher-up, whoever oversees their department. Once it gets to that person, for some reason, it's then kicked back down. So any person that has ever raised any red flags about this case doesn't want to touch it. They say, oh, Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods did their job. They did what they were supposed to do. That's false. Did you know that state police and officials offered Grosse Pointe Woods and Grosse Pointe Farms help into this case and they denied the help? Which department would deny help for a missing persons case that ended up being a, in quotes, suicide into the water? Why would they not willingly accept the help? Whenever a smaller department has an incident like this, usually the larger agencies will attempt to get involved and help with any resources that are needed. But why would Grosse Pointe Woods and Grosse Pointe Farms deny any resources from any outside source? Are you putting two and two together like I am? If Grosse Pointe Woods and Grosse Pointe Farms are corrupt, they wouldn't be able to accept help from any outside sources unless they were in on the corruption themselves. It's odd, isn't it? Not odd enough, though. It's something I expect. Grosse Pointe Woods and Grosse Pointe Farms are not adequate enough to be dealing with this type of situation. They're not adequate and equipped enough to be able to do this on their own, and it clearly shows. So this is why I continue to come back to, this is your tax dollars. These are the people in the departments of where you live. If Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods are not doing their job correctly, who holds them accountable? Who oversees their work? Please, 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 if you have the capabilities, write letters, call. I've said it many times. Share this on social media. Get the word out. The only way we can continue to fight for justice is by the squeaky wheel getting the grease. On next week's episode, we're going to be talking about how the dynamic of the family was created. The dynamic that created this divide. People say the root of all evil is money. And in this case, that's the scenario. The estate of Joann's family and her parents had left specific items listed. And in there would be lying, deceitment, falsifying documents. Ultimately, that would have put Bill Matouk, the owner of the wine store, and Joann's brother, and Joann's sister, Rosemary, both in prison. But instead, Joann, being the person that she was, refused the jail time, did not want to prosecute them, and ultimately, it ended up them being free and Joann ending up dead.